looks like Goliath is showing some signs of weakness in their fight against David. Apple lets Epic Games put Fortnite and Game Store back on iPhones in Europe. But before we discuss this latest news event, let's take a look at how we got here. So, in 2020, Epic intentionally violated the App Store rules in protest of Apple taking a 30% cut of all payments made through apps that are distributed through the App Store. Of course, Apple then said, hey, that's against our rules, you're not allowed to do that. And so they banned Epic Games, and hence Fortnite was removed from the App Store. And so Epic released this commercial to try to get people on their side.
Today, we celebrate the anniversary of the platform unification directives. For years, they have given us their songs, their labor, their dreams. In exchange, we have taken our tribute, our profits, our control. This power is ours and ours alone. We shall prevail.
So yeah, the commercial is a pretty funny parody of Apple's own 1984 commercial, where, the premise is that they're kind of fighting back against these big corporations, and a few decades later, Apple is themselves the big corporation that is being fought against. Not to say that Epic Games is some, small indie studio, but they're not exactly at the same level as Apple when it comes to the amount of money they have, at the very least. And so what happened in 2020 is, like I said, Apple blocked Fortnite from all of their devices, right? From iOS, it was removed from the App Store, and there was no way to install it. Recently, you might have heard of the DMA, which is the Digital Markets Act. As a result of this act, actually, so this is an act in the European Union, and as a result of this, the EU fined Apple over 1.8 billion euros over App Store restrictions on music streaming. So let's take a look at the details here. Well, the EU launched an investigation, and they found that they had limited competition from music streaming services such as Spotify. Spotify, for a long time, has been claiming that Apple's policies are unfair, and that they're giving their own Apple Music service an unfair advantage. Because basically, well, if they're running their own service, they don't have to pay these extra fees to themselves, right? Whereas these other services like Spotify have to put up with paying a 30% fee, which means that they're just not able to operate at the same level. Now, what's interesting is the European Competition Commissioner said that a smaller fine would have been nothing more than the equivalent of a parking fine, and that the 1.8 billion euros was designed to act as a deterrent against the repetition of such practices by Apple or others. And this is what I really like about the EU, which is when they do these things, at least in the context of fighting against large corporations that are, trying to use their size to their advantage to push competitors out of the market, is they do actually have fairly significant fines. $1.8 billion, or euros, I think that's around $2 billion right now. I'm not exactly sure. But that's a pretty big chunk of change, right? Now, Apple has an absolute boatload of money. They have, according to CNBC in 2023, they had $162 billion in cash. So this is slightly over 1% of the total cash that Apple is holding, but it's a fairly significant deterrent, right? It's not something that they can, they can absorb this loss, but they really don't want to keep absorbing losses like this. That would make Apple very hesitant to continue with their current practices. So according to the European Commission, this is a quote from the commissioner, it's important to see that if you are a company who is dominant, and if you do something illegal, it will be punished. We want to show our resolve that we'll go into these cases. And she said that the public ended up paying more than they should have for streaming services, which is where this 1.8 billion euro fine came from. She said that Apple's rules ended up harming consumers. Critical information was withheld so that consumers could not effectively use or make informed choices. Some consumers may have paid more because they weren't aware that they could pay less if they subscribed outside the app. And the case followed after complaints by Spotify, centering on Apple's App Store as the sole gateway for iPhone apps. Now, this statement here is actually really interesting. Some consumers may have paid more because they weren't aware that they can pay less if they subscribed outside the app. And we'll get to this. We'll get to why this is important. Um, but for now, all you need to know is that as part of Apple's policy, you're basically not allowed to promote outside methods of paying for things, right? So if you purchase a subscription to some service, let's say Spotify, well, Spotify isn't allowed to advertise selling that same subscription in other places where it might be cheaper, right? So they're not allowed to say, oh, instead of going through the App Store, you can get it from our site for a cheaper amount. That's not allowed according to Apple's rules, which is, it definitely contributes to this walled garden, right? Because you're not even allowed to tell consumers that there are other options available, which does seem pretty anti-competitive, at least to me. So yeah, this fine apparently represents about 0.5% of Apple's global turnover, which is, it's not enough to completely sink Apple, but they don't want to keep taking losses like this. Apple recently has announced plans to allow customers in the EU to download apps to iPhones from outside the App Store, which is a response to the Digital Markets Act, which basically said that Apple is a gatekeeper for their platform and they have to allow other app stores. And Apple isn't the only target. Microsoft and Meta have been hit with this as well. Microsoft, I believe, has had to make they've had to give users in the EU the option to change default browsers easily for Microsoft Edge and to even allow Edge to be uninstalled to be replaced with third-party browsers. And for Meta, they've been forced to open up their communications platforms. So, as far as I remember, the plan is that Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp will have to be opened up so that they can interconnect with other services, which is it's definitely a good thing for consumers, right? Because you have other options for talking to people on Facebook Messenger, right? These social media type platforms, they really have this kind of effect where if someone is on that platform, the only way to really communicate with them can often be through that platform, and you're forced to sign up to that platform if you want to communicate with that person, regardless of whether you really want to use that platform or not. And so the DMA kind of removes that restriction by saying, okay, you have to open up these messaging services, and that allows consumers to have a lot more choice. And on that topic, actually, Apple, they do have their iMessage service, right, which is very much a walled garden. It doesn't interoperate with other services. I think it has like fallback to SMS or something like that, but realistically, only Apple users can communicate with each other through iMessage. But the DMA didn't affect that because iMessage apparently has such a small market share in Europe that the European Commission just decided that, you know what, this doesn't count as having a significant enough influence that that we should bother regulating this. And so iMessage wasn't hit with the same requirements that WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger were. Now, for their part, Apple has responded to this statement. This is from March 1st, by the way, so this is about a week ago. So they have said that the decision was reached despite the Commission's failure to uncover any credible evidence of consumer harm and ignores the realities of a market that is thriving, competitive, and growing fast. Yeah, I don't know about that one. The primary advocate for this decision and the biggest beneficiary is Spotify, a company based in Stockholm, Sweden. Spotify has the largest music streaming app in the world and has met with the European Commission more than 65 times during this investigation. Well, yeah, I mean, if you're filing a complaint, if you're filing a lawsuit, then yes, you do have to meet with the people that are going to, to resolve that issue. Today, Spotify has a 56% share of Europe's streaming market, music streaming that is, more than double their closest competitors, and pays Apple nothing for the services that have helped make them one of the most recognizable brands in the world. A large part of their success is due to the App Store, along with all the tools and technologies Spotify uses to build, update, and share their app with Apple users outside the world. And they have said that they have decided that they intend to appeal this decision. To be honest, this just kind of reads like Apple kind of whining about it. I mean, it's a corporation. They're going to do this kind of thing. I don't really see a good argument by Apple that this judgment is unfair. Spotify, meanwhile, responded that this decision sends a powerful message that no company, not even a monopoly like Apple, can wield power abusively to control how other companies interact with their consumers. It is a basic concept of free markets. something that the US, by the way, seems to have forgotten, which is kind of sad. The US is fairly happy to just let some of these big companies get away with whatever they want to. Um, it's interesting that the EU is the one that seems to be pro free market in that sense, but I digress. Customers should know what options they have, and customers, not Apple, should decide what to buy and where, when, and how. Max von Thum, the Europe director of the Open Markets Institute, which researches the impact of corporate monopolies, said the large fine sets a positive precedent with which the EU would do well to draw on in future enforcement actions against tech giants. And the tech companies, of course, were given some time to comply with the full list of things that they can and can't do under the new laws, after which they could be fined for up to 10% of their turnover. So this is nothing new, right? The Digital Markets Act, it's been in place since August of last year. Apple has had plenty of time to introduce measures that let them comply with it, but I guess they just decided that, they just want to keep their walled garden as walled as possible. And several companies have sent a joint letter to the European Commission to complain about Apple's proposed scheme for compliance with the Digital Markets Act. So Apple basically said that, well, let's take a look at what the letter says. These companies don't believe that Apple's plans meet the law's requirements, and that Apple's changes both disregard the spirit and letter of the law, and if left unchanged, would make a mockery of the DMA. And in particular, there are some criticisms, to put it mildly, of Apple's planned implementation. So they have a requirement to stay with the current App Store terms or opt into new terms. They provide developers, according to this statement, with an unworkable choice that adds complexity and confusion. The letter suggests that neither option is DMA compliant and would consolidate Apple's stronghold over digital markets. And the core technology fee and transaction fees would hamper competition and prevent developers from agreeing to the unjust terms. Apple is using unfounded privacy and security concerns to limit user choice. The scare screens that Apple plans to show users will mislead and degrade the user experience. This one I actually disagree with. I think there is a reasonable argument to be made that apps installed from outside the App Store should have some kind of warning. As long as it's a simple statement that, a screen that pops up once when you install the app and says, hey, this app is installed from outside of the store, you might not be able to trust it as much as apps from within the App Store. But as long as the user can just hit OK, I think that's actually a reasonable warning to have. The fact is that Apple does have much more control over the apps in their App Store, and, for better or for worse, that does result in hopefully less spam and less, malicious apps and that sort of thing, which, of course, if they allow installing apps from outside the App Store, they would no longer have that control. So I do think a warning is reasonable in that case. But Apple is not fully allowing sideloading and is making the installation and use of new app stores difficult, risky, and financially unattractive for developers. And then, basically these companies are just telling the EU to make it, to tell Apple to improve their terms, because the terms are completely unreasonable and don't comply with the DMA in their current form. And the terms are a little bit ridiculous. So if I remember correctly, one of the terms is that, well, normally in the App Store, Apple takes a 30% cut, right? But outside the App Store, they would still be taking a 27% cut, which seems like a very high amount, right? Like if you're using some kind of payment processor, like, I don't know, PayPal, Stripe, whatever, right? They'll be taking a few percent. And so you're basically at the same 30% at that point anyway. So it's like the whole point is that Apple shouldn't be taking as big of a cut of things that they really aren't involved in. And Apple still has to approve apps that are installed from outside the App Store, by the way, so it's not like Apple is giving up that much control in this case either. So here's the full letter, at least from Spotify. A letter to the European Commission on Apple's lack of DMA compliance. We're 34 companies, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and this is basically just the same text that we saw earlier over here. Some of the comments here are actually really interesting. You know what, let's read them now, because they are quite unhinged, I think. Particularly this one from Mr. Temple that appears to have 116 upvotes. Well, or votes. I actually don't know if it's like downvotes or how comments on Mac Rumors work, but people seem to be engaging with this. So let's just read this whole comment. Core technology, there it is. Put up or shut up. Either stop using Apple developers' work or pay for it. iOS dev here who could literally never make a penny without standing on the shoulders of thousands of Apple iOS devs who've put in uncountable years of effort into areas I basically have zero experience or expertise in, ? Most people claiming Apple's cut is unearned do not know what import foundation does at the top of literally every iOS code file in literally every App Store app. Hint, it's not necessary to get an app into the App Store. Ditto for import UI kit, import Swift UI, import CryptoKit, button, and, code that uses Apple frameworks, essentially. Literally ? Of iOS apps use code written by Apple to do a staggering amount of work. 0 apps roll their own custom code instead of using the mountains of frameworks and APIs that Apple has built and perfected, complete with expected features like free dark mode rotation, language, compatibility across devices, accessibility, size, backgrounding, persistence, etc., etc., etc. 0 apps do this because it will cost 10 to 20 times as much to develop, and nobody would pay for the lesser experience. Even the simplest app would take literal years more development and still not achieve anything close to feature parity by dropping in Apple's code with 0 effort. Oh, and when iOS updates with new features or a new style, instantly that app needs massive work to retain feature parity with other apps that did 0 work to match style or make use of many new features. Sometimes a teeny bit of work to make a huge new feature work if you want. Show me an app developer who doesn't lean heavily on Apple's developers' work, and I'll show you somebody who gets to talk about the outrageous price that Apple charges for their work ? Wow, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but you know what? I'll leave that for you guys in the comments. Some people just seem to really like Apple's work and agree with this stance. Some of the comments here are more reasonable, like 2024 Apple gives me a major late 90s Microsoft vibe. A yearly per-user fee just to run an app marketplace is straight up insane. It's blatantly anti-competitive, and there's no chance it will survive regulatory scrutiny. Finally a reasonable take. Here's someone agreeing with the Apple, with this somewhat unhinged, I think, comment. This is an amazing perspective, absolutely perfect. Couldn't have said it better. People need to comprehend this. Yeah, anyway. Some people on Mac Rumors, understandably like what Apple does. So what Apple did recently is that they have announced, so this is a statement from March 6th by Epic Games. So Epic Games basically wanted to create a new account for their EU division, basically, that they intended to use that account to bring the Epic Games Store and Fortnite to iOS devices in Europe, thanks to the Digital Markets Act, right? So the Digital Markets Act allowed them to create an app store, and Epic said, okay, finally, we're getting the opportunity to do this, so let's do that. Let's create a new developer account. However, Apple has terminated that account, and so Epic Games is no longer able to develop for iOS, even in Europe, which, yeah, very much violates the DMA and shows that Apple has no intention of allowing true competition on iOS devices. That's kind of a subjective claim, but I think it makes sense, right? So they specifically quote the DMA Article 6.4, which says, "The gatekeeper shall allow and technically enable the installation and effective use of third-party software applications or software application stores using or interoperating with its operating system, and allow those software applications or software application stores to be accessed by means other than the relevant core platform services of that gatekeeper." And in disallowing Epic to create their Epic Games Store, Epic is saying that Apple is taking out one of the largest potential competitors to the Apple App Store. They're undermining their ability to be a viable competitor, and they're showing other developers what happens when you try to compete with Apple or are critical of their unfair practices. And here is the really interesting part, right? Apple said that one of the reasons they terminated the developer account only a few weeks after approving it was because we publicly criticized their proposed DMA compliance plan, and specifically, they cited this post on X, written by Tim Sweeney. And now here's the post, and I quote, this is from Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic. "Apple leadership faces some massive decisions in the coming weeks as the contradictions between their stated principles and the intended and actual consequences of their present policies are reckoned with. The App Store monopoly, the digital goods payment monopoly, the tax, the suppression of true information about competing purchasing options, the blocking of competing web browser engines, and outright destruction of web apps. It doesn't have to be this way. Apple is a few bold and visionary decisions away from being the company they once were and that they still advertise themselves to be. Beloved brand to consumers, partner to developers, and overlord to none." Yeah, so this is the tweet that Epic used as, or that Epic was banned for, according to Apple. Now, I can understand banning them if, Tim Sweeney was spewing hate speech or something like that, or, saying illegal things that, that basically Apple just said, we want absolutely nothing to do with this. In my mind, something like that would be, reasonable. You might want to, get someone like that off of off of your platform, right? But this is very much just fair criticism of Apple's practices, right? So the suppression of true information about competing purchasing options, that's one of the terms in Apple's agreement that you have to agree to in order to become a developer, right? Like I said, you're not allowed to advertise a cheaper, for example, subscription that's available elsewhere. The blocking of competing web browser engines, right? Apple absolutely does that. Every third-party browser on the App Store has to use the Safari engine. I don't remember, it's Blink or was it WebKit? Anyway, it has to be the same engine that Safari uses. And so the browser is basically just a skin on top of that engine. And the outright destruction of web apps, which is something that Apple announced recently. For whatever reason, they're just completely disallowing web apps from using engines other than the Safari engine, which to me seems absolutely crazy. Like, I have no idea why they're doing that. I guess it's to somehow preserve the fact that the Safari engine is the main engine for web browsers on iOS. It's not like this is misinformation, right? These are true statements. And sure, it's, these things might not be, not 100% objective, right? Like, this is an opinion that, it doesn't have to be this way, and Apple could be a visionary company once again. But it's reasonable criticism. And for Apple to say that this is sufficient evidence that Epic isn't going to be participating in good faith just seems absolutely ridiculous. They're just completely looking for excuses, and to be honest, I think they're grasping at straws. They've had to reverse their decision and to finally allow the Epic Games Store. Well, they've given Epic their account back, basically, which Epic is planning on using to create an alternative app store, right? The Epic Games Store. Because I just don't see how Apple would be able to justify something like that unless they want to get hit with another 1.8 billion euro fine. Which, you know what, maybe they should be if they keep behaving like this. To be honest, Apple, I do agree with Tim Sweeney on this one. I'm not the biggest Epic Games fan. There are some things that they've done that I disagree with. But I think in this specific case, they are very much in the right. Interestingly enough, actually, so this earlier case in 2020, Apple actually won that case in the United States, which is really interesting considering that Epic lost the case against Apple, but they won the case against Google, even though Google has a much more open system where you have third-party app stores. But Apple was apparently somehow immune from that, and yeah, Apple was, I don't remember exactly where it was, but somewhere Apple was basically complaining about this ruling and saying that, well, look at this US ruling, where, quite frankly, the regulators are kind of spineless. But you know what? The EU actually said, you know what? That's in the US. We don't really care what kind of rulings are made over there. We have our own laws. And I'm glad to see that the EU is actually stepping up and punishing these big companies for their monopolistic actions, which I think overall is a win for consumers. So yeah, I'm rooting for Epic Games on this one. Apple said that they're going to appeal this, and to be honest, I hope that Apple loses this case. But yeah, let me know what you think. Where do you stand on this issue? I'm firmly on the Epic Games side. Let me know in the comments.